All right, you little fifth graders, we are going to start a new unit today in social studies dealing with American history, specifically speaking on the turn of the century. The turn of the century is talking about a time period where it became, where it went from the 1800s to the 1900s. So we're talking about 1880 to about 1920. Around that time frame. Okay, a long time ago. Our first lesson is on the cattle trails. Cattle is just a group of cows. After the Civil War, Texas cattle farmers returned home to find that their cattle herds had grown tremendously while they were away. The demand for beef was growing in the East. The Union and Confederate armies consumed or ate most of the cattle. So the Civil War, it was a war between the northern states and the southern states. The northern states won, so we remained a complete country, the United States. It was a war where the southern states were trying to form their own country. Well, during that war, the Union or the northern soldiers and the Confederate or the southern soldiers needed a lot of food. They ate all the cows, just about. So the demand for beef was growing in the northern and southern states. In Texas, however, their cattle herds had grown. They had more cows than what they had when they had left for the war. So here's the problem. How do you move cattle to a place far away? Cows are very big animals. They are huge. At least 500 pounds for most of them. How do you move all those cows? Here's the solution. You herd cattle north to the railroad and then transport them east. And that is where cattle trails came from. Cowboys would move these herds of cattle to the north, and then in the north they would be loaded up into railroads, and then the trains would take the cattle where they needed to go in the northern and southern states. So what were the cattle trails? Cattle trails were routes or pathways used to transport cattle north to the railroads. And that's an old picture of a cowboy herding cattle along a trail. Cattle drives were a major economic activity in the American West, particularly between 1866 and 1886, when 20 million cattle were herded from Texas to the railheads in Kansas for shipments to stockyards in Chicago and points east. The long distances covered the need for periodic rest by riders and animals, and the establishment of railheads led to the development of cow towns across the American West. So this is where we're getting the term cowboys from. Cowboys were not much like what you see in the movies today. They were simply the people that they called drive the cattle or herd the cattle to the railroad. Why did cowboys start driving cattle? The expansion of the railroads made driving cattle easier. Railroads in the 1860s and the 1870s expanded westward, allowing ranchers the opportunity to make their cattle to the markets in the east. So simply put, the railroad made herding cattle a lot easier. You put these big animals on these railroad trains, and that train could move the cattle very easily where it needed to go. Also, the price of cattle in the north and east and the high demand for beef made driving cattle profitable. In other words, they could possibly make a lot of money. That's another reason why the cowboys decided to drive cattle. They could make that money. Also, it was not expensive to herd cattle. Only 12 cowboys were needed per 2,000 head of cattle. So it wasn't an expensive job to do. And here's how they would herd the cattle. You have your group in the middle, your group of cows, your cattle. You have a trail boss in the front. And then you have several cowboys on the side and in the back that would keep the cows grouped together and moving in the same direction. You can pause the video if you'd like to look at that longer. They had to cross rivers sometimes, and that could be dangerous for the cowboys and for the cattle. Two famous cattle trails. First, you got the Chisholm Trail. This was the very first cattle trail. It went from Texas to Kansas. And then you have the Great Western Cattle Trail. It took cattle to many different places up north. The Chisholm Trail was a trail used in the late 19th century to drive cattle overland from ranches in Texas to Kansas railheads. And this red line here is where the Chisholm Trail was located. Started in southern Texas, went through the state of Oklahoma, and then ended close to northern Texas, Abilene, Kansas. I didn't mean to say Texas. Northern Kansas, in Abilene, Kansas, specifically. The Great Western Cattle Trail. The Great Western Cattle Trail was used in the 19th century for movement of cattle to markets in the east. The trail was also known as the Western Trail, the Dodge City Trail, or the Old Texas Trail. Though less well known than the Chisholm Trail, the Great Western Cattle Trail was longer in length and carried cattle for 2 years longer than the Chisholm. The Great Western saw over 7 million cattle and horses pass through Texas and Oklahoma to the railheads in Kansas and Nebraska, therefore developing the cattle industry as far north as Wyoming and Montana. And all these little black lines is the Great Western Cattle Trail. It went to many different locations. It was not easy. Life was not easy along the cattle trails. Besides the trails, there were bones of cows and calves who couldn't keep up with the herd, and cowboys and settlers who died from accidents, diseases, or even Indian attacks. So there was a lot of danger being a cowboy herding cattle on the cattle trails. There's some Indians, Native Americans. Think about it. Today, we don't need to ship live cattle to cities all over the country. What makes things different in our world today? Think about it. The answer is we have refrigeration. We can freeze the cow meat. The Black Cowboys of Texas. There are about 35,000 cowboys that herded cows. About 9,000 of them were black cowboys. After the Civil War, slaves were free, but many had no place to go and no way to survive without continuing to work for their former slave owners. After the slaves were freed, many moved out west to work on Texas ranchers. The Black Cowboys of Texas were treated much better on the range than anywhere else. Black and white cowboys worked together. The black cowboys worked hard and even participated in rodeos. Last but not least. Ooh. Have a nice day. There you have it. It's a lot of information. Study your notes, answer all the test questions, and get busy.